I'm Scott.
I'm Bill.
And we're the Trade Guys.
You're listening to The Trade Guys, a podcast produced by CSIS where we talk about trade in terms that everyone can understand. I'm H. Andrew Schwartz, and I'm here with Scott Miller and Bill Reinsch, the CSIS Trade Guys. Coming up next on The Trade Guys, we'll talk about tariffs on Canada and Mexico. Plus, we'll talk about bills in the Senate to try to block presidential authority. And finally, we'll talk about the trade deficit, all on the next episode of The Trade Guys. Boys, we're back, and boy, is it a hell of a time to be trade guys, because Tariff Man is going off. I mean, like, this is more tariff news than I think anyone bargained for. The stock market is not happy. A lot of investors not happy. We're talking on March 6th at 3:07 p.m., and just about a half hour ago, there was a reversal. President Trump said most new tariffs on Mexico and Canada are suspended until April 2nd, and that covers everything under USMCA. Boys, what do you think here?
It's just a roller coaster ride. You know, this morning, President Sheinbaum talked to him, and his response was to suspend Mexican tariffs. Then this afternoon, they added Canada. This is 2 days after the tariffs went into effect, 3 days after the Canadians and the Mexicans tried to get him to do the same thing that he's done today. It's impossible to predict. I was saying before we began, I talked to a reporter this morning who said he didn't know if he should write the story then or if he should wait an hour and, write the next story. And there's more to come, because there's also a rumor that now that they've discovered that 80% of our potash, which is a fertilizer element, comes from Canada, there's a big movement in the farm community and the Secretary of Agriculture to exempt potash. And people are saying that's next on the list. And it's classic, because when he announced the steel and when he announced the tariffs, all of them, he said, no exceptions, no exclusions, no exemptions. And here we go, one after the other.
Yeah, there's confusion on both what is going to be affected by the tariffs and what the purpose of the tariffs is, because there's a lot of rhetoric about unfairness. There's a lot of rhetoric about the trade deficit. The Mexico and Canada tariffs have consistently looked to me like a search for leverage for border measures and particularly dealing with fentanyl. So they had a very specific purpose that was not related to trade policy directly. But it's gotten very garbled. It's tough to figure it out. So we're just going to be confused for a little while, but we'll see where this settles.
The market is one thing. Everyone's happy when the market's up. No one, of course, is happy when it's down. It's way down. And, people's gains have been completely erased. Today, at the Economic Club of New York, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said, across a continuum, I'm not worried about inflation. How can he not be worried about inflation given what's going on?
Well, look, there are a lot of factors, and most of the markets versus sort of where they were Monday morning, and this is now Thursday, are down 2 or 3%.
Yeah.
So, but there's a lot of volatility. There's variations on individual stocks. I think what the Treasury Secretary is looking at is more broadly and on a longer term basis. He's looking at, there was a whole series of puts and calls. Tariffs are trouble, but at the same time, lower energy costs are an offset to that. Lower regulation is an offset to that. Extending tax policy or perhaps improving the corporate tax rate by lowering it would be a net positive. So I think when Secretary Bessent talks, he's looking at all those factors over a longer period of time. We're looking at the volatility today and a single element, which is tariffs. It's just two different views of the same animal.
I'm more cynical than that. These are post hoc rationalizations. Trump is famous for looking at the market every day and measuring his performance based on what the market does. So the market's down. And as Andrew said, it's down and it doesn't seem to be coming back in light of today's announcement. So it continues to be down. They've wiped out all the gains since the election. And so what is Trump saying now? Just a few minutes ago said, well, I don't pay attention to the market every day. We're looking at the long term. So, if it doesn't come out the way you want, you invent a new excuse. He didn't look at the long term before, but, he can't look at the short term now because it's not telling him what he wants to hear. So, the goalposts have been moved, and I think they'll continue to do that. Things are beginning to add up, as we'll discuss a little bit later. The trade deficit in January was at a record high. The interesting factoid was the February announcement of planned job cuts, right? People getting laid off was up 245% over the previous month. So if you ask me, we're heading for a recession. Jobs are down, prices are up. We're heading for stagflation. I think that's what worries people the most. Prices are up, jobs are down, growth is going down, manufacturing is slowing, and they haven't even gone into effect yet. The tariffs haven't even gone into effect yet. So I suppose the next thing that Trump will argue is that, first of all, the first thing he'll argue is it's all Biden's fault.
Yeah, he said that.
Yes, Biden was responsible for all these. And, that has a half-life of a couple of months, and then he owns the economy. We'll see what he says, in March or April if the trend continues. But it seems to me that if the trajectory we seem to be on has not been caused by the tariffs, it'll certainly be exacerbated by the tariffs.
Well, it's interesting. I saw an interview yesterday on CNN with trade advisor and economic advisor Peter Navarro. Wolf Blitzer confronted him with the now famous Wall Street Journal editorial that called it the dumbest idea maybe ever. And Wolf said to Navarro, he said, according to the Wall Street Journal's editorial board, under this tariff plan, American-made SUVs are going to cost $9,000 more in America. And that doesn't sound good to anybody. And Navarro's response to it was essentially, and he used this language, he said, well, that's the Wall Street Journal. He said, I'm from the Main Street Journal. I don't really know what that means, but I think what he's trying to get at is their strategy is longer term. They're trying to build American jobs and, manufacturing here, and that's going to maybe take some pain. Is that really what they're trying to do here?
Well, they're trying to do a lot of things, okay? And for me, the first question is...
The question is, are they trying to do too many things?
That is possible. The initial question had to do, because the initial tariff threats to Mexico and Canada were about border security, and specifically trafficking in fentanyl. My first question is, have they reached agreement on those two items? I don't know yet, but that's what I'd look for first. Then, they're going to deal with the practical matters of exemptions and exclusions. It's very hard to plant crops without fertilizer. You don't make fertilizer without potash. And Canada is a very important source. Potash and ammonia are the two ingredients that make modern fertilizers effective.
I love that you know that.
That's how farm yields are what they are, and it's why we feed all these people around the world, why global hunger is a thing of the past. But you got to be able to do it, and you can't source these things differently next week because somebody decided to put tariffs on it. So there has to be a practical measure here, and I just think it's too early to really get clarity on how these pieces all fit together. There's no big, beautiful tax bill yet. There's no big, beautiful reconciliation that will deal with some of the spending issues that they want to tackle. And so I think we're just at a point of confusion.
What they keep talking about is come back to the United States. We want to bring manufacturing to the United States. And as Trump has said repeatedly, including this week, if you move here, there's no tariff. And what we're now beginning to see is analysts coming out of the woodwork commenting on exactly how that works. And there's just been some interviews with auto industry analysts who pointed out that even if you decide to build a plant here instead of somewhere else, you're talking about more than 3 years before that's going to be online and operational. The tariffs go into effect on April 2nd or, whenever he decides to postpone them to. But the impact that he's desiring is going to be years down the road. In the meantime, the American people pay the difference. And that, I think, is going to leave them unhappy. With the average price of a U.S. automobile approaching $50,000, you add 9 to it, that's not peanuts.
We're at a point where I think we're going to have to pull this apart more carefully. The day-to-day is frenetic, and it's very hard to pin down. So I'm at a loss to try to find a strategy in all this. And I hope that instead of glib remarks from advisors like the Main Street Journal, that we actually get some honest perspective on what are we trying to accomplish here and why do we think this works?
Okay, so obviously our trading partners are going to retaliate. This is going to bring on more pain. So what's that going to look like?
Well, it turns out it's going to be bad, I think. They're not all going to retaliate. I think it's, every country's in a different position. I think the Europeans will. The Canadians clearly were prepared to. They already announced what they were going to do. The Chinese already have. And the second time around, when he added the additional 10% this week, this time they hit the farmers, corn, pork, soybeans, other things like that. I thought they'd do that the first time, but I guess they waited for the second time. And these things are going to have a big impact. If you talk to farmers, they live on exports. We are a slow growth economy. Our population is actually declining. If you want to grow your farm, you're going to have to export. And when a major market, which is what China has been, goes up in smoke, then you've got a big problem.
Well, Bill, it's interesting. I saw a report where farmers, I think it was in Kansas, are producing grain, and that grain has always been sold to USAID, who then helps feed the world. Scott was talking about this just a minute ago. And now these farmers don't have anywhere to sell their grain. The grain they already sold is sitting there, not doing anything. And these farmers are going to really suffer, is what I took from the piece.
Yeah, it's rough. And of course, you look around here in America, and we just can't eat more ourselves.
No more.
I don't think that's a solution.
Yeah, we got to drop a few here. I mean,
some of us are trying our best.
But look, our big commodity producers are definitely in business to help feed the world. And if you can't trade, you wind up with surpluses and low prices ultimately. So it's not a good recipe at the moment. And more than anything else, some clarity of the policy would really help. We just got to get out of the glib responses and the narratives about unfairness and talk about what specifically we're trying to do here.
One thing I wanted to ask also, guys, is, Trudeau is pretty damaged in Canada, but it looks now like our good friend Chrystia Freeland is going to be prime minister and take over. I mean, I think it's a pretty distinct possibility she will. Is that going to be harder for Trump to do what he's doing with someone who's not politically damaged?
Well, first of all, my Canadian friends tell me it's going to be Mark Carney.
Wow.
And not Chrystia Freeland, but we'll know on Sunday because that's the election. And they've both campaigned on they're better able to take on Trump. And to me, the interesting thing that's going on up there, which is fascinates me, is how Trump has transformed the Canadian election. They have to have one this year.
Yeah.
I think before October. And up until Trump taking over, the Liberals, Trudeau's party, were 20 points down in the polls. And now they're slightly ahead because the election debate has been transformed. The election debate previously was on management of the economy and missteps of the Liberal government that the conservatives were attacking. Now the debate is over who is best equipped to take on Trump. And the conservative candidate, who is Trump-like, claims not to be MAGA, but Trump-like, is declining in the polls. And the Liberals are suddenly looking a lot better. So it'll be interesting if it's Freeland. Trump is on record as not liking her.
Yeah.
He thought she was not a nice person because she was their negotiator on USMACA.
Right.
So I don't think he said anything about Carney. So we'll have to wait and see. But the other thing is Sheinbaum has done better in the last couple of months than Trudeau.
Well, he likes her.
He likes her, but one of the reasons he likes her is she's new. She does not yet have a reason to dislike her.
Right.
And Trudeau, he didn't like, he's got a long experience with Trudeau. They go back to Trump's first term, and he hasn't liked him for a long time. But that raises the question, it won't be Trudeau after this week. It'll be somebody else. And that may produce a change in his attitude. We'll see.
Well, definitely it's a reversal, and it's a return of Canadian politics to where politics were in Canada for maybe the first 100 years after Confederation. Politics were really about how you deal with the U.S.
Yeah.
And the Conservatives, their politics were isolate them, don't deal with them. And the Liberals were, let's deal with them. And there was back and forth over the Canadian railroads and all sorts of things in the first 120 years of Canada's existence.
Yeah, it goes all the way back to fur trapping.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. And that was the original debate between the two parties. And when you got to Mulroney and
Reagan,
all of a sudden, Canadian politics became not all about the U.S. relationship.
Remember the John Candy movie, Blame Canada, where the United States launched an invasion of Canada, which did not end well.
That was Michael Moore, wrote that movie, and it's called Canadian Bacon.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful examination. It does have John Candy as the star of it. Dan Aykroyd, who is Canadian, plays a Mountie, which John Candy drives a garbage truck into Canada with anti-Canadian slogans painted on it. And Dan Aykroyd, the bounty, stops the truck and fines them for not having bilingual graffiti. It's a very funny movie. I mean,
okay. Well, we're going to have to dial that one up for sure.
It may not be so funny now, when...
Well,
what a mess.
Life imitating art imitating life.
Yes.
The other thing that's come up that was entirely predictable that we're starting to see is the wave of examples of stupid things that are going to happen. This leads to the long line of people now forming outside the White House asking for exemptions or exceptions. It was the auto guys yesterday.
And they were effective because the three big ones, GM, Stellantis, and Ford, said, if this goes forward, you're going to erase all of our profits.
It's a compelling story. I mean, the thing about sob stories is they're often true.
Yep.
And the potash story is another one. And the smaller one that I thought was fascinating that I learned was apparently Alaska ships ore to British Columbia, where it's refined into, among other things, the byproduct is germanium, which is exported to the United States, but it's going to have the tariff. Even though it started out in Alaska, germanium was produced in British Columbia, so it's technically a Canadian product. It's going to be shipped to the United States, built into chips, which are going to be exported back to Canada, and they will pay a tariff if Canadians retaliate. So reporters now are having a field day discovering these stories.
Yeah.
And they all make sense, each one by one, and then they start to add up. And when Trump rolled these things out, he said, no exceptions, no exemptions, but, you can see what's happening. The auto guys call up and, they get a deal. Now the potash guys are going to call up and they're going to get a deal, and on and on and on,
Going to spend a lot of time making deals.
It's very medieval. The supplicants approach the throne, they kiss the foot, they present their petition, and then he, in his magnanimity, grants it or does not.
Oh, God. There we go. Tariff, man.
The good thing about all the stories that are appearing nowadays is it helps the case of free trade. There's a reason that human beings have exchange with one another.
Yes.
It improves their lives. Okay. And it's a setback when you take these things away.
Well, it has the effect of making people not want to buy anything.
Yep. You do get a little nervous. And of course, there's hedging all around, which I think is one of the stories behind the increasing trade deficit.
I mean, I certainly wouldn't want to walk into a Ford dealer and get an F-150 that cost $10,000 more than it did a week ago.
That sounds like a tough prospect for both consumer and seller.
Totally. All right, let's talk about, there was a Democratic bill to rein in presidential tariff authority. That didn't go very far. What kind of restrictions did it try to place on presidential authority?
Yeah, this has been really interesting to watch. I think in the end, it may not amount to anything, but it will amount, I think, to one uncomfortable vote, which I'm looking forward to seeing. There's two things going on. There have been two different bills introduced in the Congress, so far, I think entirely by Democrats. One would say just that we can't impose tariffs against our allies and against free trade agreement partners, which would include Canada and Mexico. That was, I think, Senator Coons' bill, which has been introduced in the Senate with a bunch of co-sponsors. The other bill fastens on or seizes on the statute that Trump is using for a lot of these tariffs, which is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA. And there's two things of note in there. There's a debate going on amongst legal scholars as to whether or not the powers that the president has under IEPA, if he declares an emergency, include assessing tariffs. The word tariffs is not in the statute, but in my judgment, there are plenty of other words in the statute about regulating imports that I think would probably give him the tariff authority. But there are lawyers that are arguing that essentially, because the word tariff is not there, and because tariffs are regulated under the Constitution by the Congress, and Congress didn't include the word, they did not intend that the president have tariff authority via this statute. That can be litigated, but it can also be legislated. And our good friend, Representative Delbaney, who was on the podcast last summer, and newsflash, Andrew, is going to be on it again this coming May, has introduced a bill along with a number of other Democrats to clarify that in IEPA, it does not include tariff authority, which would limit the president's ability to do anything on tariffs under that statute. Now, they're Democratic bills. I don't think they're likely to go anywhere. But what might go somewhere is another nuance that cropped up today. Another provision of IEPA says that if the president declares an emergency, The Congress can override that by passing a joint resolution. Now, the president can veto that, so that effectively means you'd have to have 2/3 in both bodies to get there. But apparently, the resolution that you can use to do that is what's called a privilege resolution, which means that the author of it can get a vote on it. It doesn't get bottled up in committee. And a number of, I assume, Democrats have introduced several different resolutions to override the emergency that's been declared in the Canadian and Mexican case. So I think what that means, and we'll have to stay tuned for this, but I think what that means is at some point they can call this up, get a vote, and it'll be very interesting to see how that vote comes out. If they wait a little bit, and if we do have $9,000 cars, and $8 a dozen eggs, and avocados that are 40 cents more expensive than before.
Tomatoes
go up. That may be a vote that Republicans may have to vote for. It'll be interesting to see what happens.
Yep.
It also suggests that finally there's some small sign that members of Congress are standing up for their constitutional rights to set tariff authority.
Yeah, certainly. There's every reason for the Congress to regain its power over tariffs, because that is expressly identified power of the Article 1 branch. So I'm happy to see that. At the same time, delegation of authority to the president very seldom is withdrawn by the Congress. Part of it is it's difficult, takes 2/3 majority. You've got to be able to basically have a veto-proof majority. And part of it is there's just a lot of things that they'll let the president do because the executive needs to deal with emergencies very rapidly. You can talk yourself into that. So very rarely, Bill and I were talking before we started recording, and other than things like the impoundment authority that was withdrawn from President Nixon in the Budget Act of 73 or 74, it's very rare that those things really happen and get past a presidential veto. So
I think that's right, and I don't think this will pass. Well, I don't think it'll get 2/3, but it would really be an embarrassment, I think, for the administration's trade policy if either body actually passes it.
Yes.
Well, and at a certain point, we're talking about Congress taking back its authority, but at a certain point, really what they're going to be doing is hopefully listening to their constituents. And if their constituents are in pain and don't like this, that has to influence them somehow, you would think.
I think that's right. And there are signs of constituent unhappiness. We've been reading accounts of town meetings that members of Congress have been holding.
We have.
That have been acrimonious and in one case adjourned early in the face of lots of people shouting at the host. And I chuckled because the consequence of all that was a note from the House Republican leadership to members advising them not to hold any more town meetings.
Yeah.
That's the way to deal with dissent. Just don't give anybody the opportunity to complain.
If you want to get yelled at, host a meeting. If you don't, forget it.
Yeah, I think Americans have always found a way to complain.
Yeah, it's rough out there. And
it's a little rough out there. I agree.
The interesting thing is this beginning to happen now. Several Democrats have announced they are going to hold town meetings in their Republican districts next door.
That's going to happen. There's no question. Guys, before we leave today, let's talk about one of our favorite subjects, the trade deficit and the impact of tariffs on the trade deficit. Are there scenarios in which this imbalanced trade deficit matters to economic growth or national security?
We're looking at a 1-month data set, and it's very hard to make any judgments about something happening for a month. Certainly, trade deficit has gone up. Part of that is, I would expect, we'll find out it's hedging against tariffs, that you import items early, you increase your stocks of essential intermediate goods. If you're a manufacturer, for instance, you increase your on-hand stocks so you don't get caught in a confusing situation at the border, or you don't face higher tariffs immediately. So that's probably some of it. The U.S. will almost always run an overall trade deficit because we're the reserve currency, and people hold a lot of dollars outside the United States, which is in some ways a good thing, but it does make whoever's currency is used as a reserve currency tends to run current account deficits. But President Trump has found a measure that he really likes. It's the bilateral trade deficit or surplus. It doesn't really do what he thinks it does, but it is his personal measure of unfairness. And he's probably going to keep using it, and that will cause a lot of attention on the trade deficit and the difficulty of bringing it down. When you're printing large amounts of money, spending in a way that runs very large fiscal deficits, it's almost impossible to lower the current account or trade deficit. So as long as Congress keeps spending, we'll probably run trade deficits with all our key partners.
I think Scott's right. January was extraordinary because the deficit surged an additional 34% over the previous month, which is a lot. I think it was mostly stockpiling, as Scott said, people getting ready for the tariffs. And of course, then if the tariffs actually ever do go into effect, which we'll have to wait and see because these things go back and forth as we've been discussing, if they ever actually do go into effect, then the deficit will decline because you'll see a significant drop in imports at that point. But, the reality is we've had a trade deficit since 1975. And every year, the country hasn't collapsed. It's hard, I think, to take a macro data point like that and make a national security argument out of it. You can pinpoint individual sectors, individual products where we don't want to be dependent on foreign sources of supply for security reasons. But that's a different argument than simply the overall trade deficit. But, the irony of all that is, as Scott said, it is the metric that Trump uses. Scott was the first one to report this. I had not thought about it until he pointed it out during Trump's administration. In his first term, he consistently went after the countries with which we have the largest deficits. And you're seeing it again. China, Canada, Mexico are three of the big 4 or 5. And I think he'll turn eventually to Japan, Korea, now Vietnam, because they've surged. And Europe as a whole. For him, it's an important metric, even though I think Scott's right. You can't find very many economists that will say that it makes a huge amount of difference.
All right, guys. It's been great talking tariffs. It's been great talking about Tariff Man. I'm sure by the time this podcast actually comes out, 5 other things will happen, but
it will be out of date by the time people are listening to this, guaranteed.
But we're trying. Scott, you had an announcement you wanted to make regarding a CSIS product. Let's shoot it over to you.
Yes, and it's a program that I've worked on for a long time, and I'm very happy to be offering it again with my colleagues in CSIS Executive Education. It's a program called Decoding DC. It is designed, it's a 4-day program for mid-career executives. We get embassy officials, private sector people, NGO representatives, all sorts of people who are new to the Washington environment. It's really about how the government operates in real terms and how you can stay on top of it, how you understand what's going on and appreciate the various day-to-day tensions that'll look like total craziness if you're not tuned in to why it's happening and what might happen next. So if you're new to Washington as a professional, whether government or non-government, please take a look at this course. It is the week of March 24th, Monday through Thursday. I'll be in Washington for this. I love teaching it. It's a terrific course. People who have gone through it have said that it was a great benefit to their career. So a 4-day course, lots of interesting people who'll be there with, and you'll wind up more effective on your way out. So think about it. It's on csis.org/executive education.
You guys heard it first here. Boys, we'll see you next week. More tariff stuff.
Thanks.
Thank you.
To our listeners, if you have a question for the Trade Guys, write us at tradeguys@csis.org. That's tradeguys@csis.org. We'll read some of your emails and have the Trade Guys react to it. You've been listening to The Trade Guys, a CSIS podcast.